Client-side MVC, the next big thing. This is a presentation that I did to the IEEE in Austin a few days ago. Who are ThoughtWorks? Global consultancy, 2,300 people or more. We're flat in that we can perhaps call the guy that owns the company complain. We are pioneers of Agile, at least in the enterprise, for the last 12 years. For a while, we were the only sizable consultancy to do so. We have promoted individually dependency injection, test automation, and a few other things. Continuous delivery probably being most notable of the recent ones. Martin Fowler and Jim Highsmith are Agile Manifesto signatories. They're also employees of ThoughtWorks. Client-side MVC, what is it? Okay, so first of all, what is MVC? It's a 1978 design pattern popularized by the Smalltalk community and then referred to ever since by the more modern languages Java, .NET, Ruby and others as something they either do or don't do. Java's always been friendlier to MVC, .NET not so much. .NET had alternate patterns, MVP, MVVM, but really MVC has remained the alluring thing for the industry for all these years. So client-side means that it's on the browser, server-side, the traditional space for this, with at least in respect to web applications, would have been popularized by frameworks, Spring for one, Struts and others. So what type of apps is this stuff suitable for? Well, perhaps mostly enterprise applications or apps that you have maybe a fixed set of users would be using or signing into for a specific purpose. So not so much static public web sites that would be more documentation or content centric, but discrete applications. Could be shopping carts, could be booking systems, could be anything that basically you know what the experience is your customer is going to do because you've spent a while building it. SEO, well, maybe not so much. This could change. It's probably likely that it will change, and we'll see the search engines, probably Google first, spider into some of these more rudimentary applications such that the search results would count some of the pages that are otherwise enabled by the likes of these client-side MVC technologies. So what's the productivity benefit? So we can think of HTML as defined in 1991 as being great for static documents. Really, there's nothing in there that's Turing complete. And we'd think that maybe client-side MVC is an extension to HTML that adds if and for loops. It also binds to data, so it allows us to separate the model out from the view, and we'll show in due course that this is the principal benefit. And we could ask, didn't server-side MVC do that? Well, it did, but it sent whole HTML pages from the server to the client in GET operations, which in themselves then had no Turing completeness at that stage. So there's many choices, probably 14 or so. There's a guy called Adi Osamani who's basically put together this site quite a while ago, and he's evolving it ever since to show and contrast each of these libraries. He's used a to-do list as the metaphor for the viability of these technologies, and if we click through on that link, which we won't do right now, but I did it on the day, you can go and see some of these things and see what they look like. So which do I recommend? So two in particular, Angular, which has been made by Google's, and Knockout, which has been made by Microsoft developers and others. So these two take the same approach for HTML templating. They extend HTML by adding attributes, or maybe in the case of Knockout the attribute is a standard thing, but it's a reuse of that field for extended meaning. What happens is the HTML arrives on the client in that sort of template form. The JavaScript library is loaded, the page is almost instantaneously rewritten as the DOM is loaded. This should appeal to designers as much as programmers. Now, Backbone perhaps is the elephant in the room. We haven't talked about it up to this point. It's the dominant and leading, perhaps, technology in the space, but I don't particularly like it because its template fragments are hidden inside script tags. So both Angular and Knockout also have this mode of operation, but it's not their normal mode of operation. So I don't like it because it doesn't have a thing that I'm going to call designability, which I'll show you shortly. Now, I'm going to say that also Backbone is a deal more verbose than both Knockout and Angular. And that to me means boilerplate code. What do the two frameworks I like have in common? They both support rapid prototyping. It's possible for UX people to completely work on this stuff without developers, or at least up to a certain moment in time. Now, there could be a massive code reduction versus the traditional solutions. This stuff's going to work better in more recent browsers than the older ones. I think Knockout have actually spent a lot of time remaining performant on IE6. That's not to say that Angular doesn't work on IE6. It's probably that because Microsoft still has to exist in an ecosystem with IE6, Microsoft developers are going to be friendlier to IE6. So we're also going to think that as we use these technologies to develop things with, then they're going to be quicker and cheaper to develop, maybe a deal or an order cheaper to develop than what we'd previously been working with. So what's the difference? Not a lot really. I think the JavaScript is slightly smaller for Angular, possibly in some cases almost negligible for at least the early phases of the application that you might be building. And then there's a popularity aspect. Now this is totally arbitrary, but .NET teams are likely to want to stick with .NET technologies. As such, their natural choice will be towards Knockout. Anywhere else in the language landscape, Angular is probably going to be on an equal footing, if not slightly ahead. Okay, some trends. There's a lot of things missing from this diagram, but we can see a progression from a number of frameworks in the MVC space that existed at the turn of the millennia. We saw JavaScript come into its own in the middle of the noughties, and then some really interesting technologies come along towards the end of the decade. Gwt, Dojo, and Cappuccino are three that spring to mind. Gwt is Java cross-compiled to JavaScript, which is very interesting in many ways. Dojo is an evolved toolkit that's entirely written in JavaScript. Incidentally, IBM supports Dojo. But the problem with Dojo, I think, is there's lots and lots of typing in there for that sort of stuff. Cappuccino is almost a revolution. I'm not entirely sure that it and Objective-J are going to stay the course because they're an order more complicated to code for. However, the applications that you may make with them are incredibly impressive, as 280slides.net really proved until they took it down, did they? I'm not sure. And then most recently we see the likes of these modern client-side technologies. Now, Angular probably started before Backbone, definitely started before Knockout, but I think that Backbone is not really in the same league as Angular and Knockout in terms of capability. However, all of these things are definitely designed for the modern browsers and intended to be dominant, minimalistic JavaScript technologies. So some very conjectural opinion. I've got a little sort of grid thing here, and not everything's on it, but I think that both Knockout and Angular are sane and terse. I think Backbone, Spine, and some others might be sane but more verbose. XJS is very interesting technology in its own, has some features that I like about it very much, but I think it's also down the wrong road and is slightly on the insane side. And then if we actually really were thinking of developing a enterprise web application in Objective-C and Cappuccino, we probably should have our heads examined. And just for fun, I've plotted the lively kernel, which is a squeak-like operating system written in JavaScript. I've plotted it off the scale of insane. Design mode, so one of my drivers. So if we load up actually this slide I didn't show to the Austin lot, this has been added since. If we load up one of these applications but we comment out the import of either Angular or Knockout, we'll see this sort of thing going on. Now what you can see here is basically the template in some sort of quasi-functional state. Nothing of the application will actually work, but the browser's given it a good go of rendering. So what we can see is a text entry field, what needs to be done, A single row that would repeat currently has the placeholder text loading ... in it, and then right at the bottom there's a footer that represents stuff that's in the page that's communicative, like how many to-do items are there, 3 filters all active and completed, and on the right hand side, can't quite see it, is something that should be a button that says clear however many there are to clear. So that's nearly okay, but I think it took me explaining to you what those were going to do, at least the item on the left. So what I've done is I've mocked up something that I would have preferred, interestingly, in order to gain real estate on the page, I've deleted all active and completed, but I have remaining length, and then space, then item, and then another, in this moustache template language, a remaining length piping into a plural suffix, so that would be, say, 0, 1, or more than 1, piping into plural suffix, which is a function that we'll see the like of in a minute, and that would turn it into S or an empty string. So I like that better. Backbone. So if we do the same thing for the to-do application of Addy's website, and we remove the import of the Backbone library, apart from some aesthetic differences which we should ignore, we're going to see that there's almost none of this application is visible in design mode. So the repeating row is missing, the footers with some functions and some output fields in is also missing. For that reason, I don't like Backbone, and 10 or so of the other technologies. Now, under the hood. So thank you for staying with us so far. Now we'll get to the active demos. So here is knockout. So we'll add a few items, and you can see all the attributes in the footer and what they're communicating, plus you saw the functioning of the application. And then the code for the same in the page, which is the important bit. The crucial piece to Backbone is the usage of data bind. So this is the input field. We're giving it a name, current. We're going to suggest that when it's clicked, or sorry, when you press enter, it's going to invoke a method, or sorry, a function called add, which we'll see in a minute. Now we'll also see the list of to-dos as we've added them. So this is coded in Knockout with a for each of to-dos. Note that the repeating element is on the unordered list. Then inside here we're going to see more use of data binds to actually put in fields and things like that and double-click events onto the view. And then the footer comes down here with the to-do counts, use of remaining count fields, other functions, and in fact that's the entirety of the view logic. So Angular, pretty much the same. Two items left, one to clear. Then the code for Angular. The difference between Angular and Knockout is that Angular has a series of discrete attributes that is added to HTML that again its Bootstrap understands and works on. So we're mapping to a field called new to do. So we didn't show this in Knockout, but in Angular, so the if equivalent for Turing completeness is ng-show and its counterpart ng-hide. So this is going to say this whole section will only show if there's any to-dos. So to-dos plural is a thing we're going to see in a model in a minute. ng-repeats, here's the looping construct. This time, rather than being on the unordered list, it's on the list item. So we're going to say for each to-do and to-dos, and a nice feature of Angular is we can, in this little macro language, we can pipe results of some lookups on rows into something, in this case, that's going to filter based on a subset. So that was the all completed or cancelled, all that was in the footer of that thing. There's a double-click event tied in. There's some class logic and so forth. Then here's the footer with some templating stuff going on for the fields going out. ng pluralize, which I'm not sure I would use myself, as mentioned, and things like that. So what we're going to also do for Angular is look at the JavaScript and into the controllers, which should only be one, to-do.js, and here's the whole of the logic for this application. Now, so here's to-dos being defined. Now we're going off to a method to-do retrieve store, which I'm guessing is going to take that from HTML5 data store. New to-do initialized to nothing. And then the interesting functions we were talking about earlier was add to-do. So knockout's pretty much the same as this. You've got a little guard to make sure you don't add a blank one. Here's you adding something, right? So we're a little fragment of JSON with 3 key value pairs, the title, which has been taken from the field for the input, and not completed, and we're not editing it. And then we reset the new to do to blank because we've just added it. Edit, finishing, remove to do, much the same in knockout. This also, knockouts one was also in a JS folder. And then there's a number of things here that are helping the footers. Completed to-dos, remaining to-dos, and clear done is the one that's tied to that button. So another really important takeaway that I think people should try and model is the fact that the document on the wire is almost our contracts. So it doesn't matter what technology your backend is, you're going to be serving up JSON and shipping it with gets to the client. The client's going to present that. Hopefully it's already shaped to support the view in question. And then as you save it, you're either pushing it back as a put in exactly the same style as you received the document, or you're doing a series of discrete post operations on individual things that are happening within the document. It might be harder to code than the put, but it also might be a lower payload coming back to the back end. In fact, in some cases, the ThoughtWorks teams active with this stuff are choosing post over put, but I feel personally that we might be better if we tried to make put work. So backends, Java.NET, Rails, Erlang, Haskell, Python, it doesn't really matter as long as it can serve up JSON and receive it. So that probably means transparent bindings to the object's language in question is useful. Maybe if you can't do transparent, then some annotation-driven scheme will be just as good. The server-side page is less important now, so the page would be JSP, SP, ERB, and alike. You're still going to have that sort of stuff if you're going to be logging in, because you really don't want to do that in Ajax. Possibly also shopping carts are high-security items where PCI compliance for one will be important, and you might have offloaded that to a different machine so that you can actually do the correct handshaking and choreography around accepting a payment for a cart contents and have a high assurance that no hacker has managed to find a way in. So JSON is the language that's going to fly between the server and the browser now. We mentioned in the previous slide that we think maybe it should be the dominant modeling contract. The HTML for your application is no longer ASP or JSP. It's not being rendered on the server side and shipped to the client side in subtle differently ways for each person that's logged in, etc. This one's going to be an identical page that will be served up again and again, and as such browsers could easily cache it, and that is if you weren't caching it in CDNs alongside your CSS and imagery and stuff like that. So with the advent of this type of application, put and deletes are going to become important, and whereas previously in the past we've been post or get, or sometimes post redirect get. So the IEEE gang were also promised that I would show them Selenium, which I did. This might be not new to everyone. Interestingly, for the event in itself, there was more scribbling for the Selenium section than there was for the Angular and Knockout section. So this chart's slightly out of date. There was another chart more recently purloined from Indeed.com on the trends side of their application that showed QTP and Selenium far closer together than this thing here. So what is Selenium? It's an open source testing technology. It would perhaps be a rival to HP's Quick Test Professional. There's a custom to-do app that I made that has a slight change to the one that's been hosted by Addy and the gang, which I'll explain later. And I'm going to do a live demo. Well, actually I'm not. I'm going to pretend to do a live demo of a Groovy script that tests it. But instead, I'm going to show you a blog entry that I wrote and show you the Groovy script here, and then I'm going to show you the test running. Oh look, there it is. It ran in less than a second. So what happened here, we've got some Groovy importing some grapes, which are basically jars by another name in Groovyland, some imports to really reinforce the fact that we're importing them, some setting up of WebDriver, Selenium 2, and another technology that we're going to use here, which is Fluent Selenium. Then we're going to point it at the websites in question, which wasn't a to-do list, it was a story navigator. Oops, I forgot. And then on that particular page, we're going to confirm something is true. We're going to interact with an input field, press enter, or actually we're not, we're just going to type into the input field. In this case, Angular wakes up, subsets the row set from 3 to 1, and then we're going to confirm that within a second at least, 1 of 3 stories was evident on the page rather than 3 of 3 stories, which was up here. So there's a typo in the previous page. Just here, it's the wrong application. So we're going to also talk about Angular's own functional test runner. This was super impressive. So I'm going to click it, as I did on the night. And what it does is it's a dog food test of Angular's own documentation set. So Angular actually has rectangles within the documentation which are snippets of example code. In fact, they're whole Angular example applications, so separate model view controller apps that don't actually share program space. And what that means is this scenario runner can identify them in the page, identify them, and then launch them, or at least launch tests against them. And what we can see here with these green lozenges at the top is successful running tests. So the Angular team used this themselves as a part of the proof that Angular is good to ship. And what really we're showing here is the fact that this is the most impressive of all usages of this scenario runner technology to date. Now it could be in coming months, other people make other things for, let's say, shopping carts and the like, but right now showing the Angular team's own dog food application is the best way of selling this stuff. And you can see the application under test is actually there in the bottom third of the screen, and as the green lozenges expand to take more of the screen, then the application is pushed down and slightly out of the view of the viewport, but it's perfectly functional. It's difficult to kill as well. So I'm going to press Ctrl-C. So back to the presentation. Performance testing. So this is a moment of folly of mine in that I tried to put together a performance application using Selenium, which I'm co-creator of the original version, and it's folly because it's too much. There's Angular working in a page as well as Selenium, and they're both using a lot of JavaScripts, and they kind of fight each other. So we have the to-do application I alluded to earlier. The optimization of this one is I've removed the CSS, that's incidental, but the to-do list is at the bottom of the screen rather than the top. And the reason is that if we keep adding this list and it keeps growing longer and the to-do list keeps pushing down, because WebDriver needs to actually have the field visible in the screen, or in fact every element visible in the screen at the time that it interacts with it, and that could include querying, it basically means the application, if I didn't do this, would scroll up and down rapidly, which would affect the test. That's not to say that it's a bed of roses without, because the test is still affected by the presence of Selenium. So I'm going to close that. I'm going to go back to our presentation, and we're going to run a performance test. So I have the performance test out on GitHub, and so we'll just have a quick look at that. And here it is. Groovy again, grapes, imports, new Firefox. This time we're not using another library, we're just going direct to be as fast as possible. We're also doing more immediate lookup schemes, because this is all about testing the speed of an application. So we do 1,000 iterations of trying to add a QWERTY prefix string as a to-do, and then verifying that it's arrived on the page, and then carrying on doing the next one. So let's run a test. This one's going to load Firefox. And off it goes. I mean, it's very fast at this stage, but it slows down later. Okay, so, we've already admitted that maybe Selenium's the wrong tool for testing this stuff, so we'll just show you roughly how fast this stuff can be if you didn't have Selenium in the mix. So the Angular team, Mishko Hevery in particular, has a JS fiddle that shows a bunch of simulated to-dos in a list, and he can prove, at least to the model, that you can add 1,000 at a time fairly effectively. So 2,000 just added, add another 1,000. Took about 4 or 5 seconds, which is pretty impressive. Certainly faster than a round trip to a server and back again. Okay, so one last slide, which is the technologies that I've been talking about for a number of years, Angular, and then latterly inclusive of Knockout, and all the aspects of the same that I think are relevant, including, say, an alleged best practice, some hypothesizing around browser plugins and things like that. And then maybe for fun, I've talked about the progression of web technologies from 1993 through to the current day. So click around on some of those if you're interested in some more ramblings on this topic. Thank you.